The transmission everyone remembers is the calm one. The Eagle has landed. Measured voice, mission control breathing again. A flag, a footprint, a sentence written for history. The transmissions nobody plays are the ones before it. 12:02, 12:01. Computer alarms screaming through the descent. A guidance system overloading less than 2,000 meters above a surface no human had ever touched. A commander flying manual past a boulder field that wasn't on any map. A fuel gauge dropping toward a number that meant abort or crash, and nothing in between. 17 seconds. That is how much fuel remained in the descent stage of Eagle when its footpads finally touched lunar dust. Not 17 minutes, 17 seconds of margin between the first moon landing and a smoking crater on the Sea of Tranquility. That is the version they don't put on the commemorative coin. And before we go further, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is for you right now, whether you grew up believing Apollo was a clean win, a polished triumph, engineered to perfection. Because almost everyone did. That is the version the public was sold. That is the version the documentaries play. And that is the version that has quietly cost us our ability to understand what those crews actually saw. When Buzz Aldrin, decades later, said in an interview that the Apollo crew saw something out there, the internet did what the internet does. It turned an old man's careful phrasing into a UFO story. It built an entire mythology on a sentence he later clarified. He was describing one of the 4 panels that fell away from the upper stage of the Saturn V during translunar coast, a piece of his own rocket, drifting alongside him through the dark. That is the small, true version of what he said. But there is a larger, harder version of what those crews actually witnessed. And it has been mistranslated for over 50 years. Because what was really out there, what really shouldn't have been there, in any sane engineering sense, was not a spacecraft. It was the moon itself, behaving in ways the mission was barely built to survive, doing things to the hardware, to the bodies, to the timeline that nobody at the press conferences wanted to dwell on. Think about the picture you carry of Apollo 11. 3 men, white suits, a flag, the thin grey landscape. A controlled, almost stately operation, narrated in that flat nasal voice that makes everything sound routine. Now overlay the actual telemetry. A landing radar feeding the guidance computer more data than it could process. An astronaut flying by hand because the autopilot was steering them into a crater. A lunar module so light it was essentially aluminum foil pressurized to keep 3 lungs alive. A communication link so fragile that a single dropped signal would have left a crew stranded with no way to coordinate ascent. That is not a triumph. That is a knife edge. And the men standing on that edge knew it. You can hear it in the post-flight debriefs, the ones civilians almost never read. The voice changes. The certainty drops away. Aldrin describing the strange way the dust moved. Armstrong describing the surface as harder, stranger, more unforgiving than the simulators had ever suggested. A crew in a foil can, 384,000 kilometers from any possible rescue, looking at a world that was already, in small, invisible ways, damaging the spacecraft they were standing inside. The thing Aldrin really meant, the thing the headlines softened, is this. The moon shouldn't have let them leave. And the only reason it did is a margin so thin it should not exist in any honest history
of human spaceflight. The story you remember is the clean one. 3 Americans, a flag, a footprint, a safe return. 6 landings in total, 12 men walking on another world. A Cold War won in vacuum and dust. That is the Apollo narrative carved into school textbooks and stamped onto commemorative quarters. That story is not false. It is incomplete in a way that matters, because every one of those landings lived inside a margin so thin that by any modern safety review, it would not be allowed to fly. NASA today operates under failure probabilities expressed in fractions of a percent. Apollo flew under failure probabilities its own engineers privately estimated near 1 in 20. Some estimates went higher. Werner von Braun himself, asked about Apollo 11's odds, gave a number that would have grounded the entire program in any other decade. Think about what that means. 1 in 20. Roll a 20-sided die and watch a crew die. That was the gamble, repeated 6 times, and the dice kept landing the right way. Look at the details the triumph narrative quietly skips.
Apollo 11 landed with 17 seconds of fuel and a guidance computer screaming overload, alarms it was never supposed to throw on a real mission. Apollo 12 was struck by lightning twice in the first minute of flight, and only a single quick-thinking engineer, remembering an obscure switch setting, kept the mission from being aborted into the Atlantic. Apollo 13 needed no introduction. An oxygen tank ruptured halfway to the moon, and a crew survived inside a lifeboat designed for 2 days, used for 4, by improvising a carbon dioxide scrubber out of duct tape, a sock, and a plastic bag. Apollo 14 docked with its command module only on the 6th attempt, with mission rules quietly bent to allow the 7th. Apollo 16 nearly aborted because of a stuck gimbal in the service propulsion engine. And then there is the detail that, more than any other, collapses the polished version of Apollo. When Armstrong and Aldrin returned to the lunar module after their moonwalk, ready to begin the most critical engine burn in human history, the one that would lift them off the surface and back toward the orbiting command module, they discovered a broken circuit breaker. The plastic stem of the ascent engine arming switch had snapped off, almost certainly knocked loose by the bulky portable life support system on one of their backs as they moved inside the cramped cabin. Without that switch, the ascent engine would not fire. Without that engine, they were not coming home. The most expensive program in the history of American science, the geopolitical centerpiece of an entire decade, the dream of every astronaut and engineer who had worked for 10 years toward this single moment, was about to be defeated by a broken piece of plastic the size of a fingernail. Aldrin solved it with a felt-tip pen. He jammed the pen barrel into the empty hole where the switch had been, completed the circuit by hand, and the engine lit. That is not the work of a polished, redundant, mature engineering system. That is improvisation at the edge of catastrophe. If that was the version with everything going right, the version with the trained crew and the working hardware and the celebrated outcome, then ask yourself the harder question. What does the moon look like when something goes wrong? The answer is what they actually saw, and it is worse than a UFO. When you picture the moon, you picture a place, a destination, somewhere with a surface, with terrain, with horizons. The word itself implies geography, and geography implies a place a human being could, in principle, simply be. That picture is the most expensive misconception in space history. The moon is not a destination. The moon is an environment, and the environment is hostile in ways the Earth has never prepared a human body to understand. Start with temperature. The lunar surface at noon, in full sunlight, climbs to roughly 120 degrees Celsius, hot enough to boil water several times over. At lunar night, the same patch of ground falls to nearly -170. a swing of nearly 300 degrees in the same square meter, separated only by the slow rotation of a world without weather. No air to carry heat away, no clouds to soften the sun, no night that ends after 8 hours. The lunar night lasts roughly 14 Earth days, 2 weeks of darkness colder than the deepest Antarctic winter, followed by 2 weeks of unfiltered solar radiation hot enough to soften aluminum. Now strip away the atmosphere. There isn't one. There is no buffer between the surface and the raw output of the sun. No magnetic field either. Earth lives inside an invisible shield of magnetic lines that deflects most of the lethal radiation streaming off our star. The moon has nothing. Cosmic rays, solar particles, energetic protons that on Earth would never reach the ground, hit the lunar surface directly and continuously. The Apollo crews stood inside that bath, protected only by the millimeters of their suits and the thin metal of the lander. Then there is the dust. On Earth, dust is weathered. Wind, water, time, biology, all of it rounds the edges of every grain, softens it, integrates it. On the moon, none of that exists. The regolith is the product of 4 billion years of micrometeorite impacts, grinding rock into shards that have never been smoothed. Under a microscope, lunar dust looks like broken glass. Microscopic blades, electrostatically charged, because solar wind ionizes the surface. The dust clings to everything. It works its way into seals, into joints, into lungs. Cernan, Apollo 17, said the dust was the single most restrictive factor in surface operations. Schmidt, the only geologist to walk on the moon, developed an allergic reaction inside the cabin and called it lunar hay fever. Aldrin described the smell when the dust contaminated the lunar module after the moonwalk. Spent gunpowder. A smell that meant the moon had followed them inside. Think about that. They sealed the hatch. They depressurized, repressurized, removed their helmets, and the moon was already in the cabin with them. In the air they were breathing, in the fabric of their suits, in the corners of their eyes. This is the environment we celebrate as a destination. A place where the sun cooks unshielded metal, the dark freezes it, the radiation cuts through it, and the ground itself is a fine glass powder that infiltrates every system designed to keep humans alive. Now imagine that environment doing exactly what it is supposed to do, behaving normally, and the spacecraft still barely surviving. That is the weak point Apollo exposed, and nobody fixed it. Here is the part of Apollo that almost nobody talks about. The hardware was not robust. It was not over-engineered. It was not built with the redundancy you would expect from a program flying humans to another world. It was built to one standard and one standard only: light enough and fast enough to meet a Cold War deadline. Every kilogram mattered. Every kilogram you added to the lunar module had to be lifted off Earth by a Saturn V, accelerated to translunar velocity, decelerated into lunar orbit, descended to the surface, and then accelerated back up again. The propellant cost of carrying mass to the moon and back is brutal. So engineers stripped everything: margin, backup, spare capacity. The lunar module was so thin in places that a dropped screwdriver could have punched through the wall. The crews were warned not to lean against certain panels. And the ascent stage, the part of the lander that had to lift Armstrong and Aldrin off the surface, had no backup engine. None. One engine, one nozzle, one ignition sequence. If it failed to light, there was no second attempt. There was no plan B, no rescue mission. There was no plan B. The crew would simply remain on the moon until their oxygen ran out. That is not redundancy. That is acceptance of catastrophic single-point failure as a design philosophy. Now stack the close calls. Apollo 1, before any flight, killed 3 astronauts on the launch pad in a pure oxygen fire that engineers had warned about for months. Apollo 12, struck by lightning at 36 seconds into flight. The command module went dark. Telemetry scrambled. The mission was seconds from abort when a single flight controller, John Aaron, called out a switch setting he had memorized from an obscure ground test. SCE to AUX. The crew didn't know what it meant. They flipped it anyway. The systems came back. Apollo 13. An oxygen tank, manufactured years earlier, dropped during ground handling, modified with incompatible heater specifications, exploded en route to the moon. The crew survived on improvisation, duct tape, and the lunar module's life support stretched far past its design limits. Apollo 14. The docking system that connects the command module to the lunar module refused to latch. 5 attempts failed. On the 6th, mission rules were quietly bent. Apollo 16. A backup system on the service propulsion engine showed an oscillation that, by the rulebook, should have aborted the lunar landing. Engineers improvised an exception in real time. 6 landings, 6 different failure modes that almost killed crews. Each one solved by luck, by improvisation, by a single engineer remembering the right thing at the right second. That is not a track record of mature engineering. That is a track record of survival. And here is the harder version of the same fact. We are about to do it again, not with the same scale, with a bigger scale. Longer stays, polar terrain, larger crews, more complex hardware, more launches per mission, more interfaces, more places to fail. If that was the small version of the problem, what happens when we try to do it bigger? Because that is exactly what we are about to attempt. The most dangerous sentence in modern space policy is also the most reassuring one. We've done this before. It sounds true. It feels true. 12 men walked on the moon. The flag is still there. The hardware exists in museums. The math, in principle, is the same math. So returning should be, what? A software update on a 50-year-old achievement? That is the lie buried inside the linear thinking. Scale does not preserve category. A bigger version of Apollo is not Apollo plus more. It is a categorically different problem wearing the same name. Start with where Artemis is going. Not the Sea of Tranquility, not the equatorial belt where Apollo landed, where the lighting is forgiving and the trajectories are clean. The lunar South Pole, a region of permanently shadowed craters and grazing sunlight that throws shadows hundreds of meters long. The terrain is steeper, the lighting harsher, the navigation harder. NASA wants the South Pole because there is water ice there. The same physics that preserves the ice, the eternal cold and shadow, also makes the landing far more dangerous. Now look at the architecture. Apollo flew 1 rocket, 1 mission, 1 landing. Artemis 3, as currently planned, requires the SLS to launch the Orion capsule with crew, and separately requires Starship to function as the human landing system. And Starship, to reach the lunar surface with enough fuel to land and ascend, cannot fly there directly. It needs to be refueled in Earth orbit first. Estimates from NASA and independent analysts put that refueling at somewhere between 10 and 20 tanker launches per single lunar landing. Read that again. 20 rockets, give or take, to put 1 crew on the moon. Every one of those launches has to succeed. Every cryogenic propellant transfer in orbit, a technology that has never been operationally demonstrated at this scale, has to work. Every interface between every system has to hold. Apollo used 1 launch per landing. Artemis may use 20. That is not a refinement. That is a complexity explosion, and the cost reflects it. The NASA Inspector General has put the per-mission cost of SLS and Orion at roughly $4.1 billion. Per launch, not per program, per single mission. That number does not include the Starship refueling chain. It does not include the ground systems. It does not include the years of slippage already baked into the schedule. The free return trajectory that saved Apollo 13, the orbital geometry that let a damaged spacecraft loop around the Moon and fall back toward Earth automatically, does not exist for a South Polar mission. The orbital mechanics are different. A crew stranded at the lunar South Pole has no automatic ride home. The rescue window is measured in weeks, possibly months, not days. This is the part the press releases skip. Going back to the Moon under Artemis is not Apollo with better computers. It is a categorically harder mission with categorically less margin, attempted by an agency that has not landed a human anywhere beyond low Earth orbit since 1972. And the body, the actual human body that has to live through this, has its own opinion about all of it. The astronauts came home. That is the line you remember. They walked out of the capsule, waved at the cameras, attended the parades. The flight surgeons cleared them. The public moved on. The damage took decades to surface. Start with the eyes. Apollo crews reported during the translunar coast flashes of light visible even with their eyes closed. Brief streaks of brightness inside their own vision. They were not imagining it. They were watching individual cosmic ray particles pass through the vitreous humor of their eyeballs and strike the retina. Each flash a heavy ion fired by some distant stellar event, crossing the solar system, passing through the hull of the spacecraft, passing through their skulls, and registering as a photon their brain could not distinguish from light. Years later, the cataract rate among Apollo astronauts came immeasurably higher than among their non-flying peers. The radiation they absorbed during those 6 to 12-day missions, brief by any standard, was enough to leave a permanent signature in the lenses of their eyes. Now consider the dust again, from the body's perspective. Lunar regolith is not just abrasive, it is biologically reactive. The grains are so fine they reach deep into the lung. They are so chemically unweathered that, on contact with moisture, they generate reactive compounds. Studies of simulated lunar dust on human lung cells show damage patterns similar to silicosis, the disease that kills miners. Schmidt, the geologist on Apollo 17, had a measurable allergic reaction inside the cabin after the third moonwalk. His airways inflamed, his eyes watered. The other crews reported sore throats, irritated sinuses, a persistent cough. That was after 6 days, after 3 EVAs. Imagine what 6 months would do. Then there is the cardiovascular toll, the bone density loss. Lunar gravity is 1/6 of Earth's. Not zero, but not enough to maintain the skeletal loading the human body has evolved to require. Long-duration crews on the ISS, in true microgravity, lose roughly 1 to 2% of bone mass per month. Lunar gravity does not erase that loss. It only slows it. A 6-month South Polar mission, the kind Artemis is building toward, would return crews with skeletons measurably weaker than the ones that left. And the Apollo cohort itself tells a quieter story. Several of the 12 moonwalkers developed cardiovascular disease at rates higher than the general astronaut population. Some studies have suggested deep space radiation exposure may be a contributing factor, though the sample size is small and the data is contested. The honest answer is that we do not yet know the full bill, but we know enough to know it is not zero.
Buzz Aldrin himself, the man who jammed a pen into a broken switch to come home, spent decades afterward fighting depression, alcoholism, and a profound difficulty re-entering ordinary life. The body holds, the mind holds, but neither comes back unchanged. Even if the body holds, even if the hardware holds, there is a logistics problem nobody at NASA will say in plain English. Here is the part that breaks every long-term lunar plan that has ever been drawn on a whiteboard. Apollo was a sprint. A sustained presence is a marathon. And the supply chain for a marathon on the moon does not yet exist. Start with the simplest question. How do you keep a crew alive? On the International Space Station, resupply runs arrive roughly every 2 to 3 months. Cargo capsules, fully loaded, dock with the station carrying food, water, oxygen tanks, spare parts, experiment supplies. The station is 400 kilometers above Earth. The delta-V cost of reaching it is moderate. The launch cadence is established, the supply chain is mature, and it still occasionally fails. The moon is roughly 1,000 times farther. The delta-V cost of putting a kilogram on the lunar surface is several times higher than putting that same kilogram in low Earth orbit. Every bottle of water, every breath of oxygen, every spare seal, every replacement filter has to be lifted off Earth, accelerated to escape velocity, decelerated into lunar orbit, and soft-landed on the surface. There is no ISS-style resupply cadence to the moon because the economics of getting there at the rate required do not yet close. Closed-loop life support, the kind that recycles water and oxygen from waste, runs at roughly 93 to 95% efficiency on the ISS. That sounds high. It is not. The remaining 5 to 7% is the loss rate that has to be made up by resupply. On a 6-month lunar mission with a crew of 4, that gap becomes hundreds of kilograms of consumables that have to arrive on schedule, every time, from a planet 3 days away. Then there is the dust again. The same regolith that scratched Apollo astronaut visors and clogged Apollo seals has not changed. EVA suits on the Apollo missions were showing significant wear after just 3 moonwalks. Joints stiffening, seals leaking, outer layers abrading. Artemis crews are being planned for dozens of EVAs per mission. The suits do not yet exist that can survive that duty cycle on the lunar surface. They are still in development. They are not the limiting factor. They are one limiting factor among many. Power is another. The lunar night is 14 Earth days long. Solar panels, the standard space power source, produce nothing during that period. A surface base would need either massive battery storage, which is heavy, or nuclear power, which is politically and technically difficult, or a location that never sees darkness, which is one reason the South Pole is attractive, but also why landing there is harder. And every one of these problems compounds. Suit failure means abort. Power failure means abort. Resupply failure means abort. A single launch scrubbed on Earth becomes a survival countdown 384,000 kilometers away. This is not transportation. This is dependency stretched across cislunar space, with a margin that thins every time a rocket misses its window. So why does the public narrative keep insisting this is going smoothly? Because the people telling the story have reasons not to tell you otherwise. Listen carefully to the language NASA uses when discussing Artemis. Listen to the verbs, listen to what is said, and listen to what is structurally absent. The program is described as on track, progressing, meeting milestones, moving forward toward a lunar return. The phrases sound concrete. They are not. They are terms of art. They are engineered to satisfy a congressional appropriations cycle, not to communicate engineering reality. Here is what on track has actually meant in practice. Artemis 1, the uncrewed test flight of the SLS rocket and Orion capsule, finally launched in November 2022, years behind its original schedule. The mission was widely declared a success. Then the heat shield came back. Inspection revealed unexpected and uneven erosion of the ablative material across the surface of the capsule. Chunks of the shield had come off during re-entry in patterns the models had not predicted. NASA's own Inspector General flagged this as a significant unresolved issue. The agency spent more than a year studying it before quietly adjusting the Artemis 2 profile, the first crewed flight, to a less demanding re-entry trajectory. A heat shield that performs unexpectedly is not a footnote. It is the one component standing between a returning crew and a fireball. Apollo lost a crew in a pad fire because oxygen and faulty wiring met under pressure. Columbia broke apart on re-entry because foam struck a wing leading edge during launch and damaged the thermal protection. Heat shields are not where you accept unexplained behavior. And yet, the public messaging around Artemis 1 treated the erosion as a manageable item on a long list, not as the kind of finding that, in a different decade, would have grounded the next flight. Look at the cost trajectory. The NASA Inspector General has repeatedly documented SLS and Orion overruns running into the billions, with per-launch costs that exceed the original program estimates by orders of magnitude. The Government Accountability Office has issued report after report flagging schedule risk on Artemis 3. Internal risk assessments use vocabulary that does not match the external talking points. Words like challenging, aggressive, optimistic timelines. Those words, in agency language, mean we do not believe this date. And the Artemis 3 date has slipped. From 2024 to 2025 to 2026, and now to 2027 at the earliest, with most independent analysts pricing in further slippage. Each slip is announced as a refinement. Each is, in honest engineering terms, a confession that the previous estimate was wrong. This is not an indictment of the engineers. They are doing the best work they can under political constraints they did not choose. The astronauts who will fly Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 are some of the most capable pilots and scientists alive. The problem is not competence. The problem is the gap between what the data says and what the press releases say. The gap between internal risk and external confidence. The astronauts are inheriting a narrative that has more political momentum than technical maturity. And here is where it stops being about one mission or one agency and starts being about something much larger. Step back from the moon for a moment. Step back from Apollo, from Artemis, from the specific hardware and the specific landing sites. Look at the pattern. Humans have not traveled beyond low Earth orbit since December 1972. That is over 50 years, 2 full generations, an entire span of human history during which the species told itself it was becoming spacefaring, and during which the actual evidence shows the opposite. We have not gone farther. We have gone back to the same shell of orbital space again and again, and called it progress. The moon is the diagnostic. It is the closest, the most documented, the most studied off-Earth environment. We have flown there. We have walked there. We have brought back samples. We have measured the radiation, mapped the terrain, catalogued the dust. And after all of that, we still cannot reliably plan a sustained human return. Now apply that to Mars. Mars is not closer. It is between roughly 55 million and 400 million kilometers away, depending on orbital geometry. One-way light time, the delay between sending a message and having it arrive, ranges from about 4 to 24 minutes. There is no real-time conversation. There is no real-time troubleshooting. If a crew on Mars has an emergency, Mission Control cannot help them in the moment. They are on their own for a duration measured not in hours, but in months. The radiation dose for a Mars mission, according to measurements from the Curiosity rover's RAD instrument and modeling by NASA and ESA, comes in at roughly 600 to 1,000 millisieverts for the full round trip, depending on solar conditions and shielding. That is well above the career limits NASA currently sets for its astronauts. It is enough to materially increase lifetime cancer risk for every crew member. And it is not optional. It is the cost of admission. There is no free return trajectory from Mars. There is no abort to Earth halfway through. Once the burn is committed, the crew is going to Mars, landing on Mars, or dying on the way. There is no rescue, no second ship coming. The architecture does not allow it. And we are talking about Mars as if it is the next step, when the previous step, the Moon, has not been solved. This is the harder pattern. The civilization that tells itself it is expanding into space is, by every honest measure, stalled at the threshold. We have lost institutional knowledge. We have lost industrial capacity. The engineers who built the Saturn V are mostly dead. The tooling is gone. The supply chains have been dismantled. The next generation of hardware is being rebuilt from scratch by a workforce that has never done it before, on a timeline that keeps slipping. The Moon is the warning, not the destination. The warning that the gap between aspiration and capability is wider than any press release will admit. So when Buzz Aldrin says something out there shouldn't have been there, the honest answer is the one nobody wanted to print. It was the truth about us. So return to the opening, the pen in the broken switch, the 17 seconds of fuel, the smell of spent gunpowder in the cabin, the flashes of light behind closed eyelids, the dust in the lungs of men who came home and slowly, over decades, paid a price the cameras never recorded. That is what shouldn't have been there. Not a ship, not a signal, not an alien visitor drifting past the porthole during translunar coast. The thing that shouldn't have been there was the entire mission, sustained by margins so thin that any honest modern review would refuse to certify them for flight. The thing that shouldn't have been there was the gap between what the public was told and what the engineers privately knew. The thing that shouldn't have been there was the comfortable story we built on top of a near disaster and repeated to ourselves until we believed our own myth. Apollo proved we can reach the Moon. It proved nothing else. It did not prove we can stay. It did not prove we can return reliably. It did not prove the human body can withstand the lunar environment for the duration a real presence would require. It did not prove the supply chain exists, or the suits exist, or the political will exists, or the institutional knowledge has survived. It proved one thing: with enough Cold War money and enough acceptance of catastrophic risk, a sufficiently motivated nation can put men on another world for a few hours and bring most of them back. That is the verdict, and it is not what the celebrations say. Let me be clear about what this is not. This is not an argument that NASA lied. It is not an argument that Apollo was faked. It is not an argument that exploration should stop, or that the engineers were incompetent, or that the astronauts were anything less than extraordinary. They were extraordinary. That is part of the point. It took men like them, flying hardware that thin, accepting risk that real, to barely succeed. The argument is not against the achievement. The argument is against the story we built around the achievement, the story that has cost us the ability to honestly plan for what comes next. Because the next crew is coming. Artemis 2 will fly. Artemis 3 will follow, eventually, on a timeline that nobody quite believes anymore. They will wear better suits, they will carry better computers, they will land on harsher terrain, stay longer, depend on more complex hardware, face deeper radiation, attempt things Apollo never attempted. And they will inherit every unsolved problem the original program carried home and quietly filed away. If we want them to come back, we have to drop the triumphant frame. We have to engineer for the Moon that actually exists, not the one the headlines describe. We have to tell the harder version of the Apollo story, because that is the version the next crew needs. Aldrin's pen, the broken switch, the dust still on the cabin floor. That is what shouldn't have been there. And that is what is still waiting for the next crew that goes back.